All right, now, that said, I want to turn to the other side of the debate here. Dualism has had many advocates, many believers, right, over the course of the centuries, and still does. What I want to then focus on is the arguments here that might be stronger, right, than various other ones here. I want to set aside number one. This is, I think, journalistically true as an explanation for why people will come to believe dualism, but it stands or falls depending on the metaphysics of the religious system that we're talking about. So this would then really mean we have to go back and talk about the metaphysical issues, including all the packages that would, or elements of the package that would be bundled into it. This is not a standalone argument here for dualism. It's merely a description of how some people do come to believe in dualism. The second issue about the nature of morality and its grounding, I want to save that. In a later unit in this course, we will turn to ethics questions and questions about where morality comes from. This does have an important backfeed loop, obviously, to this issue of human nature, but I want to deal with this later in the course. This one here has generated a very lively literature. There are lots of time and money and whole institutions devoted to investigating claims of various sorts of paranormal phenomena. I can't say that I'm impressed with very much of the results here, but that doesn't necessarily dismiss all of them. But I do have one interesting anecdote to share about the near-death phenomena. I remember at the end of a conference one evening, it was a medical ethics conference, I was sitting around with some practitioners, doctors and nurses, and we were having an argument about paranormal phenomena just like this. And the claim that they made, I thought was a very interesting analogy here, and none of them denied the reality of the near-death experience, that people, they weren't just making this up, that they really were having this kind of phenomenon here. But the explanation that one of them put forth, they had talked about this independently, and so the others were nodding their heads, was to argue that the near-death phenomenon and the psychological experience that goes with the near-death phenomena is best understood in terms of the energy source, blood, being cut off to the brain. And so that experience of being in the dark tunnel, rising toward a white light, is the psychological experience of the blood supply being cut off to the brain when there's heart failure at the moment of death. The interesting analogy that was made was to one of the older analog television sets, where when you have your analog television set plugged into the wall, the energy source in this case is electricity. It feeds the system, all of the inner workings going on in the television system, and then you have a very bright, colorful, animated set of images that are projected on the screen there. But what happens on those analog televisions when you unplug it from the wall or you hit the off switch is that suddenly all of the colors and animation goes away, the screen goes black, or it seems, except for a convergence of all of the light to a white light at the middle of the screen, which then slowly recedes off into the distance, and sometimes there can be a bit of a 3D effect there. So the analogy then that was being made is to say that this is something that is an unusual experience, but it's not something that lends support to dualism, because it can be given a purely naturalistic explanation in terms of what's happening physiologically in the brain, actually, as the physiology of the brain is shutting down. This argument here about the relationship between the physical and the psychological, again, a very controversial argument, one that has obviously some weight to it, so to speak, and many variations of this kind of argument are out there in the literature. But again, it's controversial, and people will make other kinds of analogies to say that in many cases you can have, right, one phenomenon, but you can describe it from two different perspectives, or you can describe the same perspective from a broader perspective or from a narrower perspective. And the fact that we have two different perspectives or two different vocabularies does not necessarily mean that we're talking about two different kinds of phenomena here. So for example, if I have a balloon that has been inflated, I can talk about the inflation of the balloon and the pressure from two different perspectives. I can take the balloon in my hands and I can hold it and I can compress it, and then I can describe the experience of pressure, how the balloon feels in terms of its pressure against my hand as I'm trying to squeeze it. And it's a perfectly legitimate description of pressure and an accurate description of pressure. But at the same time, we can talk about the balloon in terms of a microscopic analysis of what's going on at the balloon, or smaller than microscopic, what's going on in terms of the atoms and molecules of air inside of the balloon, and we can give a complete description of the pressure of the balloon in terms of molecular motion, and not make any reference at all to tactile psychological experiences and so on. So the point here is that we'll have two very different vocabularies: the description of the molecular motion and my psychological experience, a description of the feeling of the pressure of the balloon, but we don't have two different phenomena going on here. We have one phenomenon given two different kinds of descriptions. And so that is seen as an argument here. Now, be that as it may, there are still lots of issues worth thinking about and investigating here. Many of them are fascinating and fun. I want now to turn to a couple of arguments, actually a trio of arguments that have led people to set aside dualism, many people, and then start to articulate and defend purely naturalistic understandings of what it is to be a human being.